And good evening, everyone. Welcome again to We Are the Builders Australia. This is live study number 8. I'm with my co-host, Helen Woolley, good close friend and comrade of mine. How are you doing this evening?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Dave. How are you?
Managed to get through this. I mean, we're still going through some interesting moments. I mean, we're fortunate we're able to actually move a little bit more here, regional Victoria. I do feel for the people of Melbourne. At the moment, we're going through this lockdown. It's very trying time, especially for all those out there with no income coming in at the moment, and a lot of economic uncertainty out there. Actually, we do feel economic uncertainty here in regional Victoria as well. So, just before we move on, I just want to actually acknowledge that I'm broadcasting here from Mendigo on the land of the Jar Jar Rowan, and I'd like to acknowledge the elders of past, present, and future. I'll also acknowledge that their struggle, this started as an anti-colonial struggle for their own rights to determination, and realise that their part of their struggle is against imperialism. It's part of the broad struggle, and the struggle against imperialism is the highest stage of class struggle. And I think we have to acknowledge them that they are waging the same struggle, and we need to be united, black and white, unite to fight. And I think that's vitally important to always recognise that, instead of just paying mere lip service and everything else. And I believe we also have another comrade joining in as well. And I'd also like to welcome tonight. It is Viv Damon. I haven't seen her for a long time.
Hello, comrades. I'm sorry I'm late, but I have 2 laptops. This one is so slow. The other one stopped work. The newer one stopped working. So I checked it all yesterday. It was all fine. Okay.
Excellent. Welcome, Vivian. Welcome.
Yeah, well, welcome aboard. It's good to see you again. And we're just
and likewise
the country, and obviously not. A big welcome to everyone else tonight, and obviously in WA there. I hope everything's going well. We're still under certain lockdowns and certain degree, but it's certainly a lot more harder there. I think WA has done quite well considerably, considering compared to New South Wales and Victoria, especially New South Wales at the moment too. So look, just tonight, just for the viewers and everyone else, how are we going to run through this? We are reading out of Caleb Maupin's We Are City Builders study book. It's from the Centre of Political Innovation Educational Manual. Tonight we're on chapters 1.2.4, the rise of colour revolutions, and we'll be reading through the next 2 chapters. And what we do, we read through it, usually a page at a time, and then we go straight to the questions, and we have our discussion. So, and if you have feel for any questions, we'll answer them during that. So, and once again, Viv, it's good to see you again. So, welcome aboard.
And as I said, likewise. There's so few people here this side of the country to talk to.
Fair enough. Well, look, Helen, do you want to kick it off for tonight and start with the first 2 pages? And Viv, I'll just put you on mute, and I'll put myself on mute just to cut out any background noise.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Before I start reading, I had to think about one of the questions last week, and I don't think we answered it particularly well, Dave, on the spot. So, and one of the questions was, what do we think a good slogan would be for the situation in Australia? Like the Bolsheviks had the slogan of bread, land, and peace, bread, and land. What would be a good slogan for the current situation in Australia? And out of Venezuela came a slogan that I think is pretty pertinent to the entire world, and it's peace, life, sovereignty, and peace. And I think that pretty much sums up a slogan that we could all unite around and join forces around. So that might be something we want to discuss at some stage later on. All right, so to get on with the readings tonight, it starts on with the rise of the colour revolutions. So this reality about the nature. So last week we were talking about the synthetic left and how essentially some of the what's considered to be socialism has been corrupted, if you like, by the synthetic left. And so moving on from that, the next page talks about the rise of the colour revolution. So this reality about the nature of the synthetic left became very apparent during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of various socialist countries across the Eastern Bloc. Brzezinski's entire career involved fomenting discontent in socialist countries. He learned how to manipulate the intelligentsia of frustrated intellectuals across the socialist world. Brzezinski combined his efforts with those of the Hungarian billionaire George Soros. Soros funded money to dissident groups, helping to create instability in the socialist countries. The grievances which Brzezinski and Soros manipulated were very real. The socialist countries faced an enormous blockade, preventing the inflow of consumer goods and Western technology. In the face of constant military threats and covert efforts to overturn socialism, the Marxist-Leninist governments maintained a very authoritarian political system, not offering the freedom that many young people longed for. While the industrial workers of the socialist countries were largely content, it was the educated strata of the youth, often children of the privileged party bureaucrats, who felt stifled. In each of the various countries that saw capitalism restored during the late 1980s and early 1990s, a group of confused young intellectuals played a central role. The young nonconformists among the intellectual strata of socialist countries were in awe of blue jeans, rock music, and Western consumer goods. Most of these young dissidents did not believe they were marching to overthrow socialism, but rather marching simply for freedom. They believed that following their revolution against the Marxist-Leninist government, they could keep guaranteed employment, healthcare, and housing, but simply add to a higher level of civil liberties, artistic freedom, and an inflow of consumer goods. These illusions defined the Prague Spring of 1968 and were perpetuated up until the 1990s. The illusion was that the synthetic left represented a more humane, less authoritarian form of socialism. In reality, it simply opened the door to free market plunder and the recolonization of Eastern Europe by Western capitalism.
Yep, all good. The formula was replicated across the communist bloc. Young intellectuals mobilised to protest around vague demands for freedom. Sections of the police force and military would express sympathy with them. Western media would play up the idea that the tyrannical regime was on the verge of massacring of the peaceful demonstrations. Amid the chaos and panic, a pro-US faction of the military would seize power. The new regime, with the blessing of Washington, would then proceed to dismantle the economic system, sell off state assets, and reduce the population to extreme poverty. The vote to preserve the Soviet Union was overwhelming. The people of the smaller republics, which the US media often described as colonies that were longing for independence, voted to preserve the USSR at even higher rates than the Russians did. The popular vote was ignored by the pro-Western faction that seized power, and the Soviet Union was dissolved. In Russia, the first election following the fall of the Soviet Union resulted in a mass victories of the Communist Party. I'll repeat that again. In Russia, the first election following the fall of the Soviet Union resulted in mass victories for the Communist Party. Boris Yeltsin then used his emergency powers to dissolve the legislature, which he accused of being a red-brown alliance. When the communist deputies refused to leave their posts, Yeltsin sent the military to crush them. What followed was a bloody episode of street fighting in which 187 people were killed and 437 others were wounded. The model of staging colour revolutions to overthrow socialist and anti-imperialist governments continues up to this day. The Arab Spring of 2011 was cheered on by social media and American TV networks in language that sounded almost Trotskyist. Anne-Marie Slaughter, Samantha Power, and various figures within Hillary Clinton's State Department spoke of a global strategy of toppling independent governments and socialist states as if it was a leftist political cause. The The Silicon Valley elites and social media monopolists joined the operation. An essay by Anne-Marie Slaughter for Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, proclaims, "The people must come first. When they do not, sooner or later they will overthrow the governments." Slaughter's next text goes on to talk about the evils of populism, the need for social media-led revolutions, and how a responsibility to protect R2P clause must be added to the UN Charter in order to legitimise US efforts to topple regimes that don't respect the free market and open international system and freedom of information. One is reminded of Trotsky's theory of an endless, borderless, permanent revolution, except that Slaughter makes no pretense of being a socialist. It is a permanent revolution to preserve the rule of Western monopolist bankers. It is in the mindset of the revolutionary intelligentsia in service of the Atlantis pathology. The claim that unregulated capitalism would bring prosperity was widely discredited in Eastern Europe, as the swift imposition of free markets resulted in humanitarian crisis in which in each nation, mass unemployment, mass starvation, and mass poverty accompanied Western corporations looting the country. Sex trafficking and heroin became a big part of the new order of capitalism in Eastern Europe. The rate of suicide and drug-related deaths skyrocketed. In Russia, the rate of heroin addiction increased by roughly 900% in the decade following the fall of the Soviet Union. Naomi Klein's widely praised book, The Shock Doctrine, described the results of free market policies in Russia. More than 80% of Russian farms had gone bankrupt. Roughly 70,000 state factories had closed, creating an epidemic of unemployment. She goes on to describe how 74 million Russians lived in poverty and 25% of Russians, almost 37 million people, lived in poverty, described as desperate.
With its farms and factories closed down amid the dismantling of socialism, Russia became a captive market for the imperialists. It was forced to import its food from the United States and steel and raw materials from Western countries. Wealthy Western capitalists saw control of the Russian market as a way to reap super profits. Among those who plundered Russia was Bill Browder of Hermitage Capital Management, now featured as an expert on Vladimir Putin on Western television. He has also testified before US Congress. Klein quoted Russian academic Vladimir Gusev, who said, "The years of criminal capitalism have killed off 10% of our population. Indeed, the population of Russia decreased by 6.6 million between 1992 and 2006. US economist Andrei Gundafrank used the term economic genocide and was echoed by Russian Vice President Alexander Wutsky, who said children and the elderly had been hardest hit. Former US Senator Bill Bradley described what he observed in Russia when working with the Clinton administration in the 1990s. 30% unemployment, rampant inflation, pensions gone, savings gone, 30 or 40 years, it's all gone. No jobs. A few people doing very well who bought all of the assets from the state, but the average person, no. The rise of Russian President Vladimir Putin, now declared to be an enemy of the voices representing Western capitalism, marked a turning point as the Russian state apparatus stepped in to stop the chaos of the market. Putin's academic dissertation spoke of utilizing national champions, state-controlled mega corporations to reboot the economy. Putin gradually put his college thesis into practice. Gazprom and Rosneft were put at the center of an economy that was then reorganized around the state. Gradually moving back towards elements of central planning, the Putin government has raised living standards, restoring order from the disaster created by free market under Yeltsin. During the first 8 years of Putin's presidency, poverty was reduced by 14% and wages doubled. Russia experienced industrial expansion of more than 70%. Between 2007 and 2014, Russia's gross domestic product increased from 764 billion to 2,096.8 billion. Russia is no longer a captive market for the West. Russia's ability to grow its own food was almost wiped out during the 1990s. However, in recent years, the Putin government has constructed a modern, state-controlled agricultural system. Russia now exports more grain than any other country in the world, bringing in roughly $20 billion a year in revenue. Russia's agricultural exports jumped by 20% in 2018, and the state plans for the country to be an agricultural superpower by 2024, with a goal set for over $45 billion in revenues. Looking over the result of Putin's economic policies, Dr. Marshall Goldman of Harvard University wrote, "It is understandable why the Russian people regard Vladimir Putin as their savior. John Brown, the CEO of BP, has praised Putin's policy, saying, 'No country has come so far in such a short space of time.' Putin is not a Marxist or a leftist, and the Russian government does not espouse such politics. Putin's construction of a state-centered economy has been carried out in the name of Russian nationalism and the Orthodox Church, not social revolution and dialectical materialism. He doesn't offer permanent revolution, but rather the hope that Russia can be allowed to experience economic growth and maintain its unique identity as a long-existing Eurasian civilization without Western interference. In the 21st century, the revolutionary intelligentsia vague psychological desire for chaos in order to achieve freedom, no matter what the human cost, has become a vehicle to tear down borders and spread capitalism across the planet. With slick, romantic staging, the US State Department's efforts to topple populists and dictators who get in the way of Wall Street are presented almost like the contrived scenes from the Broadway musical Les Miserables. As a result of Western capitalism's hijacking revolutionary aesthetics, actual existing socialism has become more conservative in its messaging. Profits and instability are associated with Western social liberalism, while governments presiding over state-run economies often align themselves with traditional values."
Okay, we're on the next chapter now. We'll go through China's Great Adjustment. The organisation, founded by Mao Zedong and his comrades in the basement of a women's college dormitory in 1921, now has over 90 million members and rules over the largest country on earth in terms of population. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has presided over one of the greatest economic miracles in history. While the Marxist governments of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe crumbled in the 1980s, the CCP was getting stronger. The Chinese Communist Party is now arguably the most powerful political organisation in the world, with no other entity exercising as much authority and operating in such a disciplined manner. The Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949 and achieved the solid economic achievements for the population in its first 5 years. With Soviet assistance, Mao Zedong built the first steel mills in China, along with a network of power plants, water treatment facilities, and other critical infrastructure. While completing a stage of development which Mao referred to as a new democracy, the CCP mobilised the population to wipe out opium addiction, prostitution, venereal disease, and other social ills. Women were granted the right to vote and the right to divorce, and allowed to become part of the political process. Land was redistributed to peasants. Eventually, the peasants combined their independent tracts of land into communes and collective farms. University education greatly expanded and illiteracy was wiped out. As Deng Xiaoping explained, in 8 years between 1949 and 1957, we had completed the socialist transformation of agriculture, handicrafts and capitalist industry and commerce, and thus entered the stage of socialism. However, the Soviet Union cut its ties with China's leadership in 1961, withdrawing all of its economic assistance. Only Albania fully sided with China against the Soviet leaders. Blueprints were burned, buildings were left half-built, and the efforts to modernise the country slowed very dramatically. In response to the Soviet Union's betrayal, the Chinese Communist Party launched a campaign against revisionism and rightism. These efforts to be more revolutionary in the Soviet Union result in the rise of deeply problematic elements within the Communist Party. The rhetoric of these figures paralleled the synthetic left in Western countries. While their language seemed to be infused with communist ideology, they were largely unconcerned with raising living standards and fixated on punishing and purging people. The peak of the ultra-leftist deviation within the Chinese Communist Party came in the final years of Mao Zedong's life with the rise of the Gang of Four. The urban youth were deported from the cities and sent to the countryside to engage in farm labour. The Gang of Four cultivated a culture of public humiliation and torture, along with continued disruptions of production and education. The rules were unwritten in an atmosphere of mob rule. People were encouraged to shame and publicly torture their co-workers and neighbours for alleged anti-communist behaviours, such as wearing makeup, listening to Western music, owning anti-communist books, or not showing proper loyalty to Mao. Instead of trying to raise China's population from poverty, the Gang of Four focused on attempting to make a still deeply poor and underdeveloped country more egalitarian and pure in its application of revolutionary principles. The Gang of Four argued that economic development was not necessary to advance towards communism, saying that it is possible to transition in poverty to a higher stage. The pivot in China's political economic model began in 1976. A few months prior to the death of Mao Zedong, it was the funeral of prominent CCP leader named Zhou Enlai that marked the turning point. Zhou Enlai had been alongside Mao Zedong on the Long March and helped to lay foundations of the People's Republic with him. Zhou was viewed as a moderate who occasionally restrained the Gang of Four's extremism, and his funeral became an outpouring of grief from educated young people who were deeply worried about the future of their country and felt stifled by the chaotic political atmosphere. Chinese engineers, college professors, scientists and innovators sobbed for Zhou Enlai. The crowds at the funeral in Beijing broke into an explosion of anger and rioting that put the Communist Party on notice to a deep problem. Just like in Eastern Europe, the socialist system was stagnating. Creativity was being held back. The Soviet-style command economy desperately needed to be adjusted.
These riots and Mao's death shortly afterward paved the way for Deng Xiaoping to march into power in 1978. Deng ended the Cultural Revolution and launched his reform and opening up, heralded by the oft-quoted slogan, "Poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious." In 1980, Deng Xiaoping explained a new strategy for building up Chinese socialism. The fact that China is poor, has weak economic foundation, and is backward in education, science, and culture means that we have to go through a hard struggle. We want to make use of foreign funds and technology and to actively expand our foreign trade, but we must rely primarily on our own efforts. We are opposed to those absurd reactionary concepts of impoverished socialism, transition in poverty to a higher stage, and making revolution in poverty, touted by Lin Biao and the Gang of Four. But we are also opposed to the idea of turning China into a so-called welfare state right now, because that's impossible. We can only improve our standard of living gradually on the basis of expanded production. It is wrong to expand production without raising the people's standard of living, but it is likewise wrong, in fact impossible, to raise the people's standard of living without expanding production. Deng gave particular attention to the strata of intellectuals who had been the basis of counter-revolutionary confusion in other socialist countries during this time. Our teachers and scientists are faced with many difficulties in their living conditions, which urgently need to be overcome. Many intellectuals who are very capable, earn well under 100 yuan a month. Given slightly better working and living conditions, they would be able to solve many more problems for the state and the people and create immense additional wealth. I could not, and Caleb goes on to say, I could cite, the quote is, I could cite many more examples. Instead of stifling intellectuals, the Chinese Communist Party found ways to utilize their skills in order to create economic growth. Model cities sprung up in places like Shenzhen. Foreign investment poured into the country. As the living standard began to rise dramatically, it was clear that poverty, socialism, and the Cultural Revolution was dead, and socialism with Chinese characteristics was in bloom. Many observers have argued that China became capitalist following Deng Xiaoping's 1978 reform and opening up. However, this is not the case. Engels described the nature of capitalism, writing, "Under capitalism, the means of productions only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Communist Party, defined capitalism as a system of profits in command. Capitalism is a system in which the major centers of economic power function in order to make profits for those who own them. Socialism, on the other hand, is a system of rationally organized production. Friedrich Engels explained the nature of socialism this way. The proletariat seizes the public power and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon the predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. To be clear, socialism is not synonymous merely with state ownership. State ownership exists to some degree or other in every capitalist country. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, state ownership is very prevalent. However, the state-run oil company in Saudi Arabia simply generates revenue for the royal family. The Saudi government simply plays the role of facilitating oil production carried out in order to make profits for the royal family. In the aftermath of the Second World War, many major industries were nationalised in Britain so that they could be rebuilt with public funds. However, the state-owned postal service, railways, power plants and coal mines of post-war Britain simply exist to facilitate capitalist enterprises and their ability to make profits. The means of production still operated on the basis of preliminary transformation into capital, despite large-scale involvement. The name of socialism is defined by socialist production upon a predetermined plan. Under socialism, rational planning allows production to take place according to the overall interest of society. Deng Xiaoping was very clear that the socialist nature of China's economy would not change, despite the introduction of foreign investment and private enterprise. He explained, at present, some people, especially young people, are skeptical about the socialist system, alleging that socialism is not as good as capitalism. Such ideas must be firmly corrected. The socialist system is one thing, and the specific way of building socialism is another. Counting from the October Revolution of 1917, the Soviet Union has been engaged in building socialism for 63 years, but it is still in no position to boast about how to do it. It is true that we don't have enough experience either, and perhaps it is only now that we've begun in all earnest to search for a better road. Nevertheless, the superiority of the socialist system has been proved, even though it still needs to be displayed in more better and more convincing ways. In the future, we must and certainly will have abundant facts with which to demonstrate that the socialist system is superior to the capitalist system. This superiority should manifest itself in many ways, but first and foremost, it must be revealed in the rate of economic growth and in economic efficiency. Otherwise, there will be no point in our trying to blow our own horn. And to achieve a high rate of growth and high efficiency, it is essential to carry out our political line consistently and unfalteringly. Despite market reforms, the Chinese economy remains state-controlled. The party continues to lay out 5-year economic plans. Major industries remain under public control. The government controls the banking sector and dictates the lending of money. Private companies receive instructions from the government and are not free to produce and operate simply according to the dictates of the market.
A great example of the non-capitalist nature of the Chinese economy is the results of the stock market crash on July the 8th and 9th of 2015. During these events, the Chinese stock market dropped by roughly 30%. Over 1,400 companies filed for a trading halt. The result of a similar drop on the New York Stock Exchange would be catastrophic. Food would stop being delivered, society would come to a screeching halt. A 30% drop on the US stock market would most likely result in riots in the streets, as 55% of the US public is directly tied into Wall Street. Nothing even close to this happened in China. China's stock market is not the centre of the economy. The bulk of China's economic activity is centred around the government and its apparatus of state-owned banks and industries. The stock market functions simply as a kind of elite gambling casino for millionaires and billionaires and a mechanism for bringing in foreign capital. Less than 6% of the Chinese population is in any way tied to the stock market. The overwhelming majority of Chinese people and the Chinese economy is fully insulated from market turbulence. In 2015, after the Shanghai stock market crashed on July the 8th and 9th, the government swept in with anti-selling measures to prevent a panic on the market. The Communist Party announced that anyone caught short selling would be arrested. All major shareholders were barred from selling stock for 6 months. The state-owned enterprises followed government direction and were carefully managed in their activities. As a result of the Communist Party stepping in and taking control, the Chinese stock market was soon speeding ahead with numbers rising. This occurred just a week after the collapse that Western media declared as a long-predicted doomsday for the Chinese economy. The market exists simply to enhance the state's ability to expand the economy because the state is in control. The boom-bust cycle described by Marx in his analysis of capitalism is not a threat to China's growth. In China, the Communist Party is in command. Profits are not in command. Explaining the nature of the Communist Party's achievement, Deng wrote, China always used to be described as a heap of loose sand. But when our party came to power and rallied the whole country around it, the disunity resulting from the partitioning of the country by various forces was brought to an end. So long as the party exercises correct leadership, it can rally not only the whole membership, but also the whole nation to accomplish any mighty undertaking. The result of Deng Xiaoping's adjustment of the socialist system has been to raise 700 million people from poverty. It has also been the creation of state-controlled mega corporations like Huawei Technologies, now the largest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. And just on that off note, my personal phone's a Huawei, so go eat yourself, Morrison. I bought one. So long the party exercises correct leadership, it can only rally not only its whole membership, but also the whole nation to accomplish any mighty undertaking. The result of Deng Xiaoping's adjustment of the socialist system has been, it's been to raise 700 million people from poverty. Just read this. It has been the creation of state-controlled mega corporations like Huawei Technologies, now largest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. Sorry, I just went back a little bit there. China also has the largest hydroelectrical power plant on Earth, the Three Gorges Dam. The China Railways Corporation is now creating the fastest trains in the world, exporting and constructing high-speed railways across the world.
In 2018, every day a new Chinese millionaire was created. China even has many billionaires, but the billionaires do not rule. Every inch of the country is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, and even some of the richest people have received the death penalty if they stand in its way. Poverty alleviation, scientific breakthroughs, and technological achievements have defined China in recent decades. Despite its dramatic economic successes, problems of corruption and violation of human rights continue to plague the country. The rise of Xi Jinping has marked a significant effort by the party to end bribery and enforce its regulations. When visiting the United States in September of 2015, President Xi Jinping explained that his widely maligned anti-corruption crackdown was necessary for China's growth. He joked that it was nothing like the popular Netflix TV program House of Cards. Speaking to an audience in Seattle on September 22nd, he explained, China will continue fighting corruption. As I once said, one has to be very strong if one wants to strike the iron. The blacksmith referred to here is the Chinese Communist Party. The fundamental aim of the party is to serve the people heart and soul. The party now has over 87 million members, and unavoidably, it has problems of one kind or of another. If we let those problems go unchecked, we will risk losing the trust and support of the people. This is why we are determined to strict enforcement of party discipline as the top priority of our government. In our vigorous campaign against corruption, we have punished both tigers and flies, corrupt officials, irrespective of ranking, in response to our people's demands. Xi has also worked to adjust the Communist Party's relationship with religious groups. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, the Communist Party has improved relations with the Vatican and adjusted its policy in relation to Christians, Muslim, and Tibetan Buddhists. In 2019, China successfully landed a spacecraft on the far side of the moon. The Chang'e 4 mission utilized some of the most advanced cameras and satellite technology to achieve its historic results. The motivations for China's mission to the moon were not purely academic or scientific. The moon is home to the large deposit of the rare isotope called helium-3, which many believe could be utilized for fusion energy. Alternative energy seems to be an obsession of the Communist Party. When China announced its new regulations regarding automotive vehicles in 2017, the Wall Street Journal described them with a tone of shock, reporting, China has created the world's largest electric car market by sheer force of will. With these swift regulations, the Chinese government declared that 10% of all cars manufactured in China and imported into China be free of fossil fuel. China is now the leading creator of manufacture of new energy vehicles. Sandra Retzer of the German Agency for International Cooperation was quoted as saying that when it comes to electric cars, China is the only one in the race. It's all Chinese manufacturers. China is rapidly expanding the extraction of the minerals necessary for electric car batteries with its international partners. China's state-run mining corporations are teaming up with local African enterprises to expand production. The global oil-based apparatus of production is one of the greatest threats to China. It is also one of the largest barriers to human progress. The global oil market is dominated by Chevron, BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil, the 4 British and American super major corporations that operate on the New York and London stock exchanges. The big 4 super majors are closely tied with the big banks. ExxonMobil is the modern incarnation of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil and is closely tied to the Chase Bank. British Petroleum, BP, is closely tied to HSBC, the British home of finance, first established for the purpose of dominating the Chinese market, largely with opium imports. The autocratic Kingdom of Saudi, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates have long functioned as vassals for Western oil bankers, and as has the corrupt US-backed government of oil-rich Nigeria. Aside from a few OPEC outliers like Russia, Venezuela, and Iran, the Western bankers of London and New York have cornered the international oil markets. Along with the French oil corporation Total, the big 4 US British oil monopolies control roughly 88% of the global oil market. As long as crude oil remains the primary fuel driving the global means of production and transportation, Wall Street and London will rule the world. As a country rising up from poverty and consuming more resources than ever before, China depends on a huge amount of oil imports in order to maintain its state-controlled manufacturing apparatus. While some oil comes to China via pipelines from Russia, the majority of China's oil imports come via oil tankers in the South China Sea. The supposed escalation in the South China Sea is simply a matter of China working to secure its oil imports amid an increased US military presence. China is also in the process of creating an intercontinental canal in Nicaragua. The hope is to reduce the maritime dominance exercised by the US via control of the Panama Canal. As long as China depends on oil, it remains vulnerable to Western penetration and threats. As a result of this unique position, China is necessarily and universally recognized as the primary promoter of alternative and renewable energy resources. In 2015, 24% of China's electricity was generated by wind power. China is also the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels. China's most crucial foreign policy is the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which carries out projects of the Belt and Road Initiative. With Chinese assistance, countries across Africa, Central Asia, South America, and elsewhere have been able to build vital infrastructure like power plants, schools, railways, airports, water treatment facilities, and highways. This has resulted in a situation where the domestic economies of these long impoverished countries have been able to expand with new trade access.
China's economic policies strongly differ from the neoliberalism of the IMF and the World Bank. While the Bretton Woods institutions push countries to strip down the government budget and reduce the role of the government, China is doing the opposite. China inflates the role of the state in developing countries, enabling them to more effectively stimulate domestic businesses. As developing countries become wealthier, China becomes wealthier at the same time. The model is referred to as a win-win corporation. Prior to the rise of the Atlantis pathology and imperialism, various industrial capitalist economists in the United States and Europe, such as Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, and Frederick List, proposed similar models for global trade. There should be no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party is guided in all things by Marxism and Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and Deng Xiaoping theory and Xi Jinping thought, which has recently been added to the party's constitution. The October-December 2018 issue of the Communist Party's theoretical journal, Gishi, made the following declaration. The successful development of Chinese socialism in both theoretical and practical terms has put a spotlight on Marxism and socialism and inspired more of the world's people to believe in them. Going a step further, Chinese socialism now represents the mainstream of the world socialist movement and has revised a sense of confidence within people around the world. It is becoming a standard bearer for the development of scientific socialism in the 21st century and a pillar for a revitalisation of the world socialism. Just before we go on to the next one, I just want to have a look at how many pages we got. Yep, we should be able to finish off the last bit there. I'll start this off if you like. The nature of 21st century socialism. China sits at the centre of a new bloc of anti-imperialist countries, which largely represent the contemporary incarnation of the city-building tendencies. The Bolivarian countries of Latin America, the Islamic Republic of Iran and its allies in the Middle East, the Russian Federation and its state-run economy centred around oil and gas all represent a kind of global axis of resistance to Western capitalism. Despite the ideological diversity, they all push a message of construction, social progress, and opposition to the unrestrained greed cherished by neoliberal economists. They are humanity's repudiation of the vandalism incarnated by the Atlantis pathology. Each of these countries is governed by a state which is hostile to the interests of rich and powerful corporations and has a large base among the population. While in the Western world, it is commonly understood that corporations control government, the rising alternative to the global economy is pioneered by countries where the government controls the corporations in order to ensure continuous growth and innovation. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez took office in 1999 and said he was in favour of neither capitalism nor socialism. His Bolivarian movement, named after anti-colonial hero Simón Bolívar, represented doing whatever was best for Venezuela. However, in 2003, he announced that Venezuela would be taking the socialist road. Chavez was conscious of the fact that the kind of socialism emerging in the aftermath of the Cold War was different from the Soviet Union's model. In 2005, Chavez told an audience of the World Social Forum, "We have to reinvent socialism. It can't be the kind of socialism that we saw in the Soviet Union, but we will emerge as we develop new systems that are built on cooperation and not competition. It is impossible within the framework of the capitalist system to solve the grave problems of poverty of the majority of the world's population. We must transcend capitalism, but we cannot resort to state capitalism, which would be the same perversion of the Soviet Union. We must reclaim socialism as a thesis, a project and a path, but a new type of socialism, a humanist one, which puts humans and not machines, will the state head of everything." I'll start there, state ahead of everything. The Chavez government reconstructed the Venezuelan economy to be centered around the state-controlled oil companies, similar to Putin's economic reorganization of Russia around the national champions of oil and gas. This model of petro-socialist development had been perfected over the years. It was first put into practice by the Ba'athist Arab socialists of Iraq and Syria, Gaddafi's Islamic Socialist government of Libya, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. As Venezuela presently faces the onslaught of destabilisation and imposed shortages that began during the 2014 oil price drop. It is important to note that the Bolivarian government of Venezuela achieved prior to this crisis. In 1998, when Chavez was elected, Venezuela had only 12 public universities. Now it has 32. Between 1999 and 2009, poverty and unemployment in Venezuela were cut in half. In neighbourhoods across the country, free healthcare is provided by Cuban doctors. The Bolivarian government oversaw the eradication of adult illiteracy in the country, with Cuban illiteracy volunteers imported to carry it out. Access to modern housing was greatly expanded, with over 1 million modern housing units being constructed and interest-free loans, allowing millions of Venezuelans to build their own homes. It is because of these huge achievements that Nicolas Maduro and the United Socialist Party maintain a solid base with millions of loyal activists, even amid this recent turmoil.
In 2006, Bolivia elected a socialist president, Evo Morales. He took office and began constructing roads across the country. Morales followed a path similar to Chavez and nationalized the natural gas and other resources of the country. He also brought in Cuban literacy and medical volunteers to provide services. In 2018, Bolivia experienced the highest rate of GDP growth in any country in South America. As the state-directed economy plowed forward, Chinese investment aided the process of expansion. 2006 was also the year that the Sandinistas, Marxist Christians who led the Nicaraguan 1979 revolution, were re-elected to run the government. Their construction projects and social programs resulted in poverty being reduced in Nicaragua by 30% from 2005 to 2014. Between 2007 and 2016, the GDP of Nicaragua has risen by 36%, according to the Wall Street Journal. The Sandinista government created a network of citizen power councils to enforce the goals of the revolution on a neighborhood level. One of the most successful programs of Ortega's socialist government has been the lending of money to impoverished people in order to become micro-entrepreneurs and to form cooperatives. The World Happiness Index of the United Nations rated Nicaragua as with the highest increase of happiness of any country in the world in 2016. The wave of new happiness was generated due to the flourishing economic opportunities many Nicaraguans were seeing due to the socialist central planning. The various incarnations of 21st century socialism, be they Chinese, Bolivarian, Islamic, or Ba'athist, serve as a primary source of optimism in the world. The global bloc, centered around the two Eurasian superpowers, preaches an ideology of construction and hope. However, 21st century socialism very much reeks of the things that the synthetic left has labeled fascist. When reviewing Susan Sontag's words, this becomes very obvious. In providing services for the most impoverished and mobilizing the entire country in a joint effort to improve conditions, the new socialism is most certainly working to build a family of man. Young people in the socialist countries join the Young Pioneers and other groups that wear uniforms and are told they are part of the effort to build a better country. The leaders like Xi Jinping, Nicolas Maduro, Vladimir Putin, and Ali Saeed Khamenei are seen as father-like figures directing the country in its efforts for national rejuvenation. All-powerful hypnotic leaders, leader figures or force, orgiastic transition between mighty forces and their puppets. The will is staged publicly in the drama of the leader and the chorus. That's in reference to the way that Susan Sontag has labeled what's perceived as authoritarian governments as fascist. So that's worth noting. In China, as Xi Jinping re-emphasizes the Marxist ideology and communist aesthetics, increasingly elderly Chinese people have gathered to exercise together in public squares. Students also conduct joint exercises in front of their schools. Russia has Nashi summer camps for its high-achieving youth, where they are taught to use their skills for the good of the nation. In Bolivarian countries, the young people assemble in public parks for free martial arts classes provided by the socialist government. In China, Iran, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Russia, a spirit of selflessness is promoted. Those who give their lives to defend the revolutionary processes are viewed as great heroes, and a spirit of all for one and joint effort is promoted. 21st century socialism seems to be fulfilling the Marxist vision of rationally organized economy, marching towards the goal of great material abundance. The new socialist bloc has created societies in which production is no longer restrained by the irrationalism of greed. Millions can be raised from poverty as the state, despite whatever problems are generated by corruption and human fallibility, plans out economic activity. The socialist countries have neutralized the intellectual strata that played such a key role in dismantling the Soviet Union, and also learned to utilize the strength of the market to advance socialist planning. The socialism of the 21st century is far more capable of producing consumer goods and unleashing human creativity. Socialism does not face the stagnation and overall difficulties faced by the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. The socialist countries are developing mechanisms for continued adjustment so that their models of development do not become so rigid that they collapse as the USSR did. 21st century socialism is able to bend so it does not break. Since the Russian Revolution of 1917, socialism has taken impoverished countries and raised them up from poverty. Socialism has boosted science and the arts to a great degree and has done a huge amount to advance all of humanity. At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia and China were deeply impoverished, non-industrialized agrarian countries. Today, they are both superpowers. Cubans live far more comfortably than any other people throughout the Caribbean. South America's Bolivarian countries have taken huge measures to construct infrastructure and eradicate poverty. Governing under the slogan, "Not capitalism, but Islam," the Islamic Republic of Iran has overseen a huge amount of economic development. As these countries have risen from poverty with non-capitalist economies, the new socialism has effectively broken with much of the sentiments expressed by the revolutionary intelligentsia. In our age, the revolutionary intelligentsia has largely been absorbed into the synthetic left of Western countries. It no longer strives to advance human progress, while existing socialism often presents itself in a very conservative form as the defender of stability and traditional cultures. For those who see Marxism only as a method of deconstruction, the achievements of nations pulling together and striving for a global community of win-win cooperation can only be dismissed as fascist, and that is by the synthetic left. However, for those who view the question of historical progress in a scientific way, it must be understood that 21st century socialism stands as the modern day incarnation of the city building tendency, facing an onslaught from the vandals who crave chaos and regression.
Okay. Well, now we'll move on to the first questions. Now, thanks. That was a bit of reading to do there. Thought they were a second part on that. China was. I hope it didn't go forever, that chapter. So yeah, it was a lot to cover on the ground there. Well, out of the first chapter, and I mean, I was looking at some of these questions. I think actually one thing actually good stands out for me anyway is can we learn anything from liberal geopolitical strategists like Zbigniew Brzezinski? And I think, well, look, that's what he did. He was able to foment dissent within a socialist camp and also play on divisions as well and to expand that further and can consistently undermine. And what was interesting, I was looking through that, was the colour revolutions. I talked with a comrade about I call the deliberate dismantling of the Soviet Union. The thing is, throughout the 20th century, you had the external threat, but also the internal threat as well, and the dialectical nature between the two, the interrelation between the two, the internal and the external. And obviously they played on that, and then they escalated further and further and further. And consequently, when the Soviet Union, when you looked at it from the 1980s, it was stagnating. It was spending more time. I had to spend more on its military. It went into a war, went into Afghanistan, which was led to what we call the Afghanistan trap, or the Afghan trap. There was many other things that was just driving the factors internally into the internally in the Soviet camp. But basically, the economy was stagnating. Basically, some workers just didn't feel like they wanted to work anymore. There was just a lot of, and a black market was forming. It was interesting. Viv's just disappeared there for a minute. But it was interesting. I think we recall, I remember when you and I we were at a study class. I remember old Vic Williams was alive. For those in the audience who didn't know who he was a long-time secretary of the WA branch of the Communist Party. But he actually mentioned about a black market forming that came out. And I think actually he noticed it when he was in the Soviet Union in the mid-70s there. And he noticed how a few things they were getting away with, like how they take more food and everything else. And even then, there was things he took notes. Probably at the time, he probably may not have written down as important, but these were all important. Even just the little things, the internal threats, were important. So there's a lot to learn from that period. And this is where it can only become stronger out of as well. There's always going to be those who won't be just the external threat, but the internal threat, and those that will play on the internal divisions and everything else. It's interesting. I won't take up too long. I think it was before Stalin died, actually. He actually mentioned that the imperialists will play on the differences within the communist movement, even back then. So, and that's what we're seeing played out over the part of the course of the 20th century. I'll click us off mute if you like. Hey, how are you, Viv?
Fine. Well, that was good. Look, I'm sorry if I appear to be going to sleep and having to leave, but I've just got a bit of a health issue where I took a heavy sleeping tablet last night, and I'm ready for bed now. But that was interesting. I was. Can I just say, this is aside, I was unaware that Caleb Maupin was such a progressive person. It wasn't until I've listened to many things that he's presented, but he interviewed, Harpal Bra on the 25th of July. That was an excellent, whilst Harpal Bra is older now and hasn't got quite the vibrancy to be able to put forward his views, it was still very interesting. But that was where I discovered how progressive Caleb Maupin is. Yes, so many issues. What you've just mentioned is the vulnerabilities within a strong socialist system for internal conflict and, saboteurs. And if you read Harpal Bra's revisionism and the demise of the former of the USSR, has anyone read that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's excellent. It just points out, the mere fact that, if we want to demonstrate what socialism can do, I mean, the former Soviet Union basically only had about 40 years before Khrushchev came to power. And of course, then began the terrible tragedy of the Soviet Union with revisionism. But when, I try to demonstrate to people, despite wars of intervention, despite the Second World War and constant interference for every second of its existence by imperialism, the amazing achievements that happened, within that 40 years. And China, Ashley, my eldest son, is currently involved with the Lingnan University in Hong Kong, the Cultural Studies Department, which are seen to be all Marxists in Hong Kong. They give a great insight into mainland China, its advances, its vulnerabilities, and I'll see if I can forward something to you. Recently, I did a 5-week online forum with this group of people, and they may be people also worldwide worthwhile us here in Australia forming some contacts with. I was totally unaware of this huge community worldwide of people whose goals are not necessarily to overthrow, certainly to overthrow capitalism. It was a 5-week forum, every night except for 3 or 4 nights. The title was the South-South Global Forum on Sustainability, the Politics of Hope, People's Resilience and Resistance in Catastrophic Times. It was amazing. It absolutely was hopeful. And, just continuing with what your readings have been, if you lose hope, of course, you might as well end your life, because no matter what the situation, you have to cling to hope and optimism. But the little pieces that this university and all of the staff and so on have revealed about China, yes, there's some alarming aspects. The privatization of its healthcare system, which is, I don't know, are you aware of that? Yes, it's it's making some mistakes, and the purpose of this group in Hong Kong, and Michael Hudson, who's an amazing American economist, not in the usual terms of economy. All of his books are being translated into Chinese for the Chinese market, in hopes that it can perhaps be a bit of a guide for the Communist Party there not to fall into the trap that it could easily fall into, beginning with the privatization of its healthcare system. You can still, for minor health issues, you can have free access to free healthcare. But I'd heard all of this from all of my son's friends who are Chinese, live in China, come from mainland China to Australia. The criticisms that they were raising about, whilst they're still, this is the marvelous thing about the Chinese, they are fiercely patriotic to their country. And no matter what this country does, no matter what the West tries to do, they will never undermine the Chinese people's loyalty to its country and the Communist Party of China. That loyalty even extends as far as that, and it's going to be one of the great strengths, I think, of China. Or anyhow, look, I've said I'm instead of asking questions, I'm lecturing. Sorry.
That's all right.
That was brilliant.
Helen?
That was.
Pardon?
Well, So the question was, Viv, it was talking about this guy Brzezinski who basically went around fomenting discontent amongst intellectuals and the youth and so on. And the question is, what can we learn from that, essentially? And I think that, one of the things that is, socialists and Marxists and so on is that we have to examine these organizations and these movements from a class perspective. And of course, what we saw in Hong Kong was, they called themselves, Movement for Democracy, and they had a 10-point plan that they wanted to have, that they said was going to create more democracy and more freedom and so on. But as it unfolded, the class content of that became very apparent when they started hanging out the US flag, hanging out the British flag, and so that told us, the very direction and the very people behind that movement. And again, like the colour revolutions in the Soviet Union, like the dismantling of the Soviet Union, the primary people that are involved in those movements are the intelligentsia, the discontented intelligentsia that want more, and they're able to come up with and use the slogans of the left and use it for the purposes of their own counter-revolutionary or anti-revolutionary movements. And I think that leads right down to the question at the bottom there, Dave, where it says, how must revolutionary aesthetics and messaging be adjusted in the light of the Cold War? Or if we change that and say, well, now we've got so many people using the aesthetics and the things that the workers create for our movement, and the synthetic left and the Cold War turn it all around to make it sound like it was their slogans and their correctness, that it was their idea, and that's in terms of democracy, the left finds it even really hard now to use the word democracy because it's associated with right-wing politics, and yet democracy under socialism is the fundamental key thing that's different, from capitalism. There is no democracy under capitalism. We can only have democracy under socialism. And yet the left is afraid to use the word democracy now because it's been hijacked by the right wing and made to sound as though they are the ones that are just, the great givers of democracy. And now, we're, that's one of our aesthetics, if you like, or one of our, what's a better word for aesthetics? I don't know. It's like saying one of our, pleasurable things, one of our beautiful things is the aesthetics of socialism, and they're converting it into their reactionary.
It's one of the elevating.
One of the elevating things, correct. And so it's being changed around by the right wing and the intelligentsia to suit their purpose of discontent.
That's
yes,
it. I mean,
you're absolutely right.
And it's basically flying from that. Here in Australia, for example, what we call the left, but even the Communist Party of old, and that they actually put a lot of popular demands out there and made it popular. It was basically working class demands, everything else, from anything from universal education and healthcare right through to full employment, having a house, just all the basic bread and butter stuff. But it was like over the years, and it was deliberately done. You had the two parts of the Cold War, the early Cold War, and then the later part of the Cold War, where you're the new left, you're a communist, synthetic left, whatever, all that, and they get pretty much abandoned that altogether. Which obviously then there was the rise of the right, and also too allowed. Plus, out of the 1960s counterculture came neoliberalism. Individualism, and basically all this free market ideology. Everyone's their own person, and everyone's separate for each other. And we saw 40 years of constant neoliberal policies put onto working class people in the communities and regional towns and there, and now constantly this vacuum was then provided, and then there came the rise of the right wing populace. See, in Australia here, it was through like One Nation, for example, Pauline Hanson. So I mean, they started to fill that void, and I know that was something that was brought up years ago. Why isn't the left standing up for working people, for working families anymore? Why are they banning it? You know, they want to go on these trendy issues and other issues. And they might be important. I shouldn't call them trendy, but they were important. But the reality is, in the day, they weren't interested in the broad mass of the people anymore. And and we saw that happening. And this was just an extension of that happening. What I'm seeing, what we see today, and this is the end result now. What we're seeing.
Can I just jump in there, Dave? I think. So I think one of the things that the left really need to do is to retake our slogans and rebuild our movement on the basis of the things that are fundamental to our cause, and that is democracy, that is peace, that is life. It's our sovereignty. It's our right to be a country independent of capitalism, independent of imperialism. We should, they're our slogans, and we should retake them and build movements based on our slogans.
Yeah.
But Viv, I'm pretty sure that you know a lot about this. So I want to ask you, what can we learn from China's rise? What can we learn from the Sino-Soviet split and the Gang of Four period? And what can we learn from Deng Xiaoping's reforms?
It's all basically one question there.
Well, that's a big question. I'm not sure I know exactly what we can learn, but of course we know we can always learn something. Well, I think we need to learn and look at and build on all of the very positive aspects of the rise of China, led by and always emphasizing that it's led by the Communist Party of China. Divisions.
What do you know about the Gang of Four period, Viv?
I really have to admit to not knowing a great deal about it. I think you two would know more than I do, except that it was a destructive period. I'm just trying to recall when Caleb Maupin interviewed Harpal Brar last month, there was discussion about Harpal Brar spoke about the role of the Gang of Four. So look, I'm really sorry. I can't answer that. I'll get back to you at the next session belatedly with I'll have to listen to what Harpal Brar had to say. Plus I've ordered a number of more of his books, which I think are important. And clearly this book that you're reading from is very important. I've let a lot of things slip, unfortunately. So look, I'm very sorry. I can't answer that, except to know that from my understanding of the Gang of Four, and you can tell me if I'm incorrect, that it was a very destructive period in China's development. I can't think of anything positive that would have emanated from that, but look, I could be wrong. I'm not going to say categorically unless I'm, as a Marxist, unless I can be sure. But then even as Marxists, we make mistakes, we're fallible. But yeah, so sorry.
I think for me, one of the things that all of that suggests also, Viv, is that under socialism, there are going to be problems. we're contending with building a whole new world. And so we're going to go through processes, and we're going to go through changes, and we're going to have to confront things that we do incorrectly. And, dialectically, we know that nothing remains the same. Caleb Maupin always says A plus A does not equal A. No one A is ever going to be the same as another A.
And so every country is...
And so the processes that socialism go through are no different from any other processes. Mistakes will be made.
Any human society has always had its pitfalls, its backward steps, its forward steps. It's a constant ebb and flow of human achievements and human failures. Perhaps that's a part of the human condition, our fallibilities. And I think perhaps to expect, as we did in the Soviet Union, that the advancement was never, ever going. There were no glitches, no mistakes made. That was what I grew up believing, that it was the system advanced almost flawlessly, and where it was flawed, it was caused by the West. But human fallibility dictates that you're always going to have issues. But that is why the strength of any communist party, as the Communist Party of China or the Communist Party of the former Soviet Union, it cannot afford to give options. I mean, to give options of development and forward, steps forward, but because the powers of imperialism are so intent, 24 hours of the day, of destruction against any progressive ideas, let alone, say, a country like China or the former Soviet Union, I think the vigilance has to be extreme. And I think punishments, I remember people being appalled at, I think I recall small things like if you stole even something like a pie from your fellow working people, stole something from a shop, you were severely punished for it. And I remember seeing headlines, about people being executed for minor issues in the Soviet Union. But I think that there are no other choices. If you're trying to build a completely new human society, because the forces of resistance are so powerful, you must have very strict laws around which that society functions. But within that, of course, you do have democracy. You have a real democracy because it's controlled, in essence, by the people. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but yes, no, it's very challenging times ahead, I think. Are there other people participating in this discussion?
Yeah, we usually do, and sometimes people actually around the base watch it later on. And that,
right.
Sometimes people jump on now and might ask a question or say something.
Yes.
So we've had a few. It's gradually building up, and
yes, that's good.
And I think
it's an excellent thing that you're doing. It's marvelous.
Yeah. So I think it's we needed something happening here in Australia, I think, to kick things off. And I think, look, just looking at that question, where can we learn from China's rise? Certainly we can. We can learn from rises of all from all socialism, all the respective countries there as well. And and obviously, there are a lot of difficulties in that during its time. The Sino-Soviet split certainly didn't help things along, and that just really antagonised some differences within the communist movement, but also amongst people. There was a lot more factor. It wasn't just over Khrushchev. It was actually and his secret speech. It was actually a lot more to it than meets the eye. There were a lot of things happening at the time. And it caused that, and it caused a nasty split. And then it was actually through that the ideology. There was ones that go, I'm more communist than you are, and even France, for example, you had some of the ultra left in the mail scripts, the little red book, and calling others revisionists, and hitting people with them, little red books and that. And I think it was really in a sense where it actually moved for China. It moved into that Gang of Four period where it was certainly cut off from the rest of the world. And that Gang of Four period basically saying, well, through poverty we can achieve socialism. And there's nowhere in the classic texts of Marx and Engels, especially, but even Lenin and many others saying, no, that's not what socialism is about. Enriching people's lives. It's not about actually people in dire poverty. And there was just some ridiculous things. I think there was a story about how a group of Chinese students, or I think all engineers or inventors, they went to the US at that time on behalf of China, and they came back, and the American government gave them a particular snail. Now at the time, Nixon's recognised the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China. So has Gough Whitlam, who was Prime Minister. And obviously, China, during the Gang of Four period, also developed the three world policies as well. And it came out as the greatest threat is now Soviet socialist imperialism. And this shows you the extreme politics that was happening at the time. But when they came back, these students, they had a picture of they had presence of glass snail. That's right. They wanted to develop a colour television, and that was a bourgeois concept, and they were punished for it. And they brought back a glass snail as a gift in the US, and that was seen by the Gang of Four. No, that's just as an insult to China. I mean, we're all snails and everything, and it had those respective delegation punished for it. It was just real severe things. So by the time of Mao's death in '76, it was interesting. I was talking to someone, comrade, who actually knew someone from the Chinese Communist Party, then an Australia delegation, actually brought alongside Mao. But he says China by the mid-'70s was actually on the verge of bankruptcy. It really was. It was desperate. I mean, and I was listening to an interview by another Chinese comrade who grew up in that period. Like he was a kid, probably about my age then, and he said, we lived in a community, we lived in the huts, but the most luxury item we had was a running tap on the outside of the building. We still had to go to the toilet out in the field. And so there was a problem. And when Deng Xiaoping came along, although it wasn't just him personally, but many others, there's a problem. He arrested the Gang of Four, and they didn't realise they were anti-Marxist, and rightfully so. And a lot of people were glad to get rid of them, to be honest with you, moving forward. So there was all that period as well, and they realised we're in a desperate situation. We're totally isolated. We needed to open up to the rest of the world to allow investment to come in to advance them further. That was the situation they were in. And when he said, poverty is the enemy of socialism, and to be rich is to be glorious, it wasn't about, we're going to be turned back to capitalism. He didn't say that. There was no mention of that whatsoever. It was just saying we're in a dire situation. Our people are impoverished. We need to now. It's been distorted in such a way that we need to now open up and start developing a new path to socialism instead of just one we've been trying to anchor on. So, and then it's obviously a lot to learn from that period, and they actually managed to save themselves. They were certainly after a lot of challenges, where a lot of mistakes made, sure, and I mean a lot of crap things were made. I mean Deng Xiaoping siding with Pol Pot. I mean, what a disastrous thing that was. I mean, him attacking Angola and all that, and later on, actually under the leadership of Xi Jinping now, China's actually apologised to a lot of countries that did initially wrong by, so, and really making up for it. So they realised the mistakes that were made as well. So it was there's a lot to learn from it. I like to say, and I like the saying is, yes, there's a lot to study it in its entirely, but blindly follow none. And I think that's important.
Yeah. So one of the questions is, why does communism require vast material abundance? And that's kind of part of what you were saying there, Dave. And can society reach a higher stage in conditions of poverty? I think that if we looked at any society that's moved forward, it's moved forward because production has moved it forward. There's been an increase in production. And so from capitalism to socialism, we can only we can only do that because we live in a higher stage of production. However, what we know about capitalism and what we know about the capitalist economy is that it can't sustain that. It can't sustain the increasing amounts of production that it's able to keep generating.
Well, it has
because
to provide the wages for people to purchase what's produced.
That's right.
And if it can't do that.
Exactly.
And
so then it goes into a period of stagnation. So it's got that boom bust cycle. And so capitalism, by the very nature of it, can't sustain to keep creating material abundance. And that's where the planned, or rather the nature of socialism starts to become more apparently progressive, because under a centrally controlled economy, we can produce as much as we want because there is no profit motive behind that. And so the more we produce, the more free we become. We become free of the drudgery of having to go to work for 10 hours a day or 8 hours a day. We're living in the 21st century. Construction workers are still working something like 60 odd hours a week. What is that about? That is ridiculous. 21st century. But they have to. They're paying off $1 million homes because that's capitalism. It can generate enormous amounts of wealth, but it can't allow us all to share in that wealth. It's produced for profit.
Yeah.
And
it again goes back to who owns the means of production and then who profits by it, because the privileged West it's a bit of a new mantra that we can't continually produce, and we have enough. And sure, you look at a country like Australia, where overconsumption of pointless overconsumption is massive, along with driving those great big tanks that everyone seems to put on the road. But it always goes back to, the crisis of overproduction is when the wages are not there for people to consume. I'm talking about a worldwide situation. And if for capitalism, well, of course they want to continue building, producing and building and producing, and then they reach that crisis of where people simply can't afford it. It must happen eventually. You look at the obscene cost of housing and rents in this country. Ash, my eldest son, who's living with me at the moment, a friend purchased a property in Sydney, I think Western Sydney. Within a year, it made $100,000 pure profit. It's just an obscenity. Yes, so, and the slogans, that you've spoken about, they're important because they convey to people messages of importance. And what we, as you've both pointed out, we perhaps need some new slogans for this country to begin to advance, a different way of thinking. And what you're both doing here with this, it's an important start, because we're not getting it from the Communist Party of Australia, whilst it's made some advances of recent times. It is really condemned itself, I think, to remaining in a position that is not going to be able to advance the working class of this country towards socialism. It can with some of its slogans, but not with its actions. It's a very difficult, I think worldwide, it's very, very difficult. Imperialism has done its job, a fantastic job from the point of view of the imperialists. It smashed the spine of the union movement worldwide, one of the great strengths of the proletariat, one of the great strengths of progressive forces. It's totally divided and confused the left. I find myself more often than not agreeing with the right wing, not with the left. They're totally fractured, confused. I like your term, the synthetic left. I think I've mentioned to you, Dave, the Australian Society for the Study of Labour History.
Oh, of course, yes, yeah.
It was an amazing... I was depressed for days afterwards, along with being in an absolute rage. It was nothing but a slander of communist parties at the time of the Spanish Civil War and since. The role of the Soviet Union, it was just an really, and you have to say, an anti-working class, anti-socialist, anti-communist rant. It was appalling. And these are the people I mentioned to you, she and others are now in charge of this organization. So these are all of the things for those of us who are Marxists of the communists of the Marxist-Leninist variety. It's a huge challenge. You're finding yourself having to defend the ideology and the achievements of both China and the former Soviet Union constantly. It's a constant battle in a different way to what it was during the McCarthy era of the Cold War, which is what I grew up with. But what we're experiencing now, this new Cold War against China and Russia, it's very dangerous. Well, because you've got lunatics in charge in America.
Yeah,
I mean, they really are.
It's got to be mindful of time because it's 8:30 over here. But just want to, for the audience as well, I was just going to say is most important to understand what capitalism is profit in command, right? The production and everything is geared to make profit. That's what it comes down to. Every government legislation, every government policy is there to protect and maximise profit. That's what it is. Things are produced for profit. So food's grown not for our need, it's grown for profit. Houses are built not for our need, to house people, it's built for profit. That's what's primarily under there. That's primarily what it's there for. Under socialism, that's where the major factory or the major industries, the major banks, their resources all are under public ownership and organised around a central plan. And material abundance is allowed to grow further. And we're not afraid of growth either. Under capitalism, growth is distorted. It's distorted under the private profit motive. That's what it is. But under socialism, growth is unleashed, and there's so much material abundance that everyone is then able to lift out of poverty and move forward to a higher level of society. And it's called communism, which is obviously then the way the state is no longer required. That's what that is. And I think look, under socialism, things did happen. I mean, under the Soviet Union, the Dnieper Dam was built. I mean, healthcare was one of those most advanced in anywhere in the world. I mean, education, the literacy rate just increased. Education, heavy engineering, electrification. Amazing what they did. They led in advances in science and technology. They put the first person into space. For Christ's sake,
and a woman. Women's rights were
that's right. It was.
1921.
And the thing is, too, they defeated a Nazi war machine, which was the most powerful military machine at the time. They defeated that. And alone it cost them 27 million lives to defeat that horrible of the fascist junta. But they also developed other things as well. Did you know the mobile phone was actually invented in Russia. I don't know whether that was all sudden flashing, but it might be the
No,
CIA.
didn't know that.
All this stuff and various other things that we enjoy, prosthesics and stuff. They were world leaders in all of this and various technologies. And you look at China. Besides the Three Gorges Dam, they've got high-speed rail now. Developing high-speed rail that travel up to 600 kilometres an hour. And that will get you in it. I mean, you imagine having high-speed rail from, say, Sydney to Melbourne at 600 kilometres an hour. That'll eliminate a lot of unnecessary aircraft. So they had to build other cities people can commute. And yet within half an hour, I was talking to someone the other day, if we had a train from Bendigo here at 600 kilometres to Melbourne, I'll get there within 15 minutes. Wouldn't that be fantastic, you know? And that's what we should be talking about in Australia. High-speed rail. Let's eliminate light and pollution in that way. And also, too, what China's trying to do now is go move away from fossil fuel, looking at fusion energy, renewable, re-greening deserts. Yes, sure, there's still coal-fired power stations there in China, but they need to get away from it. They realise the fossil fuel industry is just fossil fuel is a hindrance on human development. A lot of great things have been achieved. Cuba, one of the best health systems in the world, they're able to actually not only just treat various illnesses, but actually able to use preventative care. And moving forward, that people can recover from their illnesses, and sending doctors and nurses all around the world is truly amazing feat. And then you look at Nicaragua, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, just amazing how things are moving forward in this world, but the whole anti-imperialist bloc. So, I mean, yes, it does happen. And will there be difficulties? Of course. What happened with the Soviet Union? One thing that is keeping in mind, it was under attack since day one. It had a war of intervention then from after the Russian Revolution. It had a war of intervention by imperial countries. It was always consistently under attack. And but the Soviet people achieved some many great results. So there's a lot to learn from there, and so many questions. But look, do you want to just quickly go on one question from the nature of socialism in the 21st century, or we should wrap up, Mark? Well, because we need to wrap up soon. So
yeah, whereabouts did you? Where is that question, Dave?
I was actually talking about the first question, the drilling from China's rise, etc.
Right. Yeah. No, I think we should leave it there and maybe look at some questions again next week. There's a lot there. Yeah. And I think we should say to the viewers, the stuff that we've covered in terms of the questions, the actual book has many more questions that it's asking, but you can already see that it's an impossible situation for us to cover it in an hour and a half. It just we get off onto other subjects, and we want to talk about this and talk about that.
And you have people like me going right off subject. So sorry.
Well, and I wanted to thank Vivian, because it was a bit of a surprise visit. I certainly didn't know that you were coming, and for the audience and for anybody that watches this later, Viv is a long-time communist from Western Australia, always been fantastically loyal to the working class and to the cause of socialism and communism, has never wavered under any circumstances. So an absolute stalwart of revolutionary politics. So thank you very much for coming on, Biff. It's been wonderful.
It's my pleasure. And is this a weekly event?
Fortnightly.
Fortnightly, because I'd like to join to participate and try to be a little more useful next time.
That's all right. You're most welcome to attend. It's actually a pleasure having you aboard. I mean, look, just for everyone else and also future audience that were watching this, I met Viv when I first moved over in 2005, and I joined the Communist Party back then. And that was when we talked a little bit about Vic Williams before. He was the secretary then. He passed away about 10 years ago, I think it was. And but it certainly was a lot of learning. There was a lot of struggles there as well. I've known Viv for it's well over it hasn't time flying. That was about 16 years or something. So it's certainly
long
so
time.
it's really important. It's great. It was great having you on this show. It was a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you for making me aware of this. It just demonstrates how shattered the movement is, and I just absolutely congratulate you for what you have started, And
Yeah.
I think everyone listening, if we can, in our own way, try to build, support Helen and Dave in this very important task, because there is no more important task, no matter what you think, no matter how difficult it is to pay the bills or how much you might row with your partner or friend. The most important task confronting humanity is to change this exploitive system under which we live. And I thank you again, both of you, for taking
thank
this initiative.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Well, look, we're going to round it off tonight. I think it is 8:40 p.m. our time here. I know it's a couple of hours behind in WA there, Western Standard Time. But look, I will usually end it off. And obviously, we had a few slogans tonight. I still like that slogan. We need a government of action and a fight for working people, working families. I think that's a very good one to have on as well. And I always usually put our fists in the air, but we always wound it up with this. As Karl Marx once said, workers of all countries unite. Thank you, everyone.
Dare to struggle, dare to win.
Dare to struggle.
The salute of resistance and struggle.
Yes, certainly is.
Farewell,
Thank you all.
comrades.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, see you in a fortnight.